Okay, here's where we're going to start to have some problems. So this is probably going to be the most important part of the talk, even though I think this part will be more interesting. So again, we're going beyond these limits here. Now, we have to define what we're talking about. So I'm going to use bandwidth as well as these other terms sort of interchangeably. And here's a neat paper which gives another network superiority term, the ability to make one's block be propagated much faster is part of what we regard as network superiority, while the other part of network superiority is the ability to become instantly aware of any new released block in the network. So there is something special about this. It makes it unlike other full node costs and unlike other minor inputs, such as labor, power, hardware, cooling technology, land. Those are fully internalized. As you improve those, your costs go down or your revenues go up, and so you get higher profits. But this propagation thing has a little quirk, which I'm going to explain. So I'm going to explain the problem in 9 slides. I'm going to talk about some related research in 4 slides. I'm going to talk about solutions for 7 slides. I'm going to talk about how safe these solutions are. And finally, I'm going to talk about further improvements in this area and how close we are to being 100% safe. In some ways, a sidechain is like any other bandwidth using application on your computer. If your internet is bad, you're going to have trouble streaming high definition video on the internet, and that's mostly your problem. But there's another sense in which it's the other individual's problem. So bandwidth is like distance. If you are 12 units away from someone and then you move yourself further away from them such that you're 35 units away, they are further away from you, but also you are further away from them. And it seems platitudinous and ridiculous, but it's actually quite important. If you upgrade your CPU, it does not downgrade the CPU of your rivals. And it especially doesn't do so immediately and directly the way this is. These two, you're all kind of in the same boat. Just as a chain is only as strong as its weakest link, a broadcast network is only as fast as its slowest bilateral connection. There's a very interesting paper about this on scaling decentralized blockchains, a position paper, where they try to look at the actual throughput limit and they try to establish this, like, what is the slowest bilateral connection? And if we sped up the network, how many people would we lose? And who might those people be? It's pretty interesting. Currently, right now, we have 1 megabyte per 10 minutes, ignoring SegWit. The 1 megabyte per 10 minutes is 1.7 kilobytes per second, which is very slow, on average. But if we go faster than that, we'll start losing people. And if people get too far away from each other, they lose their connectivity. So how is this relevant? This graph is going to appear twice, once before I explain, and secondly after I explain. So Peter R. presented in Montreal this concept here, that if propagation time increases, these two each here are propagation time within 2 categories of you being in a greater than 50% hash rate group or you being outside of a greater than 50% hash rate group. So within these propagation time runs from 0 to 10. And he was arguing that it's bad for you if propagation time goes up. People need to wait until they've downloaded and validated your block until they start mining. The unfortunate thing is that the effect is exactly the opposite if you happen to be in a greater than 50% trusted group. So I'm going to explain that with this clever thought experiment. And someone else invented this. It might have even been Mike Kern. I don't really remember. But I'm just going to quickly repeat it. What happens here is that there is a paradox for propagation. As your connectivity gets worse, your profits go up. Very bad. So what we're going to do is we're going to assume all is normal, and then we're going to teleport 75% of the hash rate and 10% of the transaction volume to Mars instantly. And then we're going to assume that it always takes 1 hour for messages to pass between Mars and Earth. I know that's not the actual figure. It's just an example. And I would like to point out that although we teleported them in this example, it can happen in a gradual, continuous sense. And that means that these miners here are not necessarily coordinating with each other. They didn't necessarily plan with. So this is a point that's more about mining than about miners, I hope. So here's my setup. Mars, the red planet, Earth, blue, because of the water. 25% of the hash rate here, 75 here. We're going to be stepping forward by 40 minutes each step. And I have a little diagram here for you. Green is the block that we're both on. This is the instant of teleportation. Now we start. We progress 40 minutes into the future. We should find 4 blocks because we find 1 block per 10 minutes. 3 of them should be on Mars because it's got 3/4 of the hash rate. 1 of them should be on Earth. It's got 1/4 of the hash rate. Now we find the blocks and we send them out. But again, it takes an hour for messages to pass between planets. So we progress again to time equals 3. Now Mars has found another 3 blocks. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Still, only 40 minutes has passed. So still, this block number 1 has not reached Earth. Earth has found 1 more block, block number 2. Earth's blue number 1 has not yet reached Mars. Now here's where the problems begin, because an hour has passed between time equals 2 and time equals 4. We are now in steady state. 1 block arrives from Earth, but it arrived far too late. It took an hour to get here, but in that time we moved 40 minutes twice and found 6 blocks. So 1 is no longer part of the longest chain. It is rejected. But the transactions in 1, whether or not they arrive in the block or as network messages, can now be included in 8, which is sort of a hybrid block that belongs to Mars. The transactions do get included, however. Earth finds its 3rd block, but blocks 1, 2, and 3 arrive from over here. They finally made it. 1, 2, and 3 to Earth. Now I'm going to progress to time equals 5 on the next slide. Time equals 5. We can see the true steady state of this system, which is that a block arrives on Mars and is ignored. Its transactions may make it into this block here. This is 10, 11, and 12. I ran out of space, so I used the italics. The blocks going from Earth to Mars never make it into the Mars chain, but the blocks going from Mars to Earth obliterate Earth's chances of ever finding a block. So Earth's miners can never find a winning block compared to the Mars miners. By moving to Mars, the miners have an advantage. They've defeated their competition. So hence there is an incentive to move to Mars. And this is a horrible glitch, I feel. Miners have an incentive to make their connectivity worse. This glitch is the principle behind all block withholding attacks, aka selfish mining variants. Especially where miners fill their own blocks with their own transactions of bitcoins paying to themselves, as well as the 51% attack, a very long 51% attack. It's basically like you teleport to Pluto with 51%. You build a long chain secretly, and then you teleport back to Earth. It's also the heart of the Byzantine generals' problem is so insincere when they say they didn't get a message. This is why core devs talk about bandwidth all the time. So what's going on is the one question. Like, what's different about this? Well, I brought up a few slides ago how bandwidth is inherently interpersonal, but I don't think that that's the fundamental meat of this particular problem. Instead, I think that that's the meat behind the problem of what is the actual throughput of the Bitcoin network. So I think it's clear that miners sell blocks to the network. They produce a block, and in return they get money. They get Bitcoin. But who is buying? Who gives them the money? Almost always buyer and seller are different people. But in this case, I think they're also miners. Because miners sell to the network, and the network is defined as 51% of the future hash rate. The 51% of the future hash rate are those who define the future of the network, as long as the chain is valid, part of the heaviest valid chain. I think the glitch is just that it's a peer-to-peer network and everyone's an equal peer, so there's no basis for separating people into buyers and sellers. So there's some circularity in the mining process, which I would like to now explain in full detail. When a block is found, if you're in this group over here, you're the buyer and the seller. So if you find a block, you're selling it to yourself. You can start mining immediately. But if you're in this situation, where you are not part of a greater than 50% hash rate trusted group, and you find a block, you're not selling it to yourself, you're selling it to other people. And those other people have to download and validate the block before they start mining on it. So you have to wait, or rather your block has to wait. It sort of doesn't really matter. So believe it or not, this is actually consistent with Peter R's paper. I looked it up specifically. This is the supply curve, the cost for the miner to produce a given quantity of block space. And this term here is defined, 1 over gamma c is defined as the time it takes per uncompressed megabyte to propagate block solutions to the other miners. Now again, if you're in this group, you just have to sell the block to yourself. So you get that instantaneously. And so this is 1 over gamma c, this is 0, which means that this equation is always 0, which means that while one purpose of deriving this equation was to say that supply was a function of quantity, Q, since it's now always 0, it is no longer, in this case, dependent on Q. As I just tried to explain, I actually feel that it should be negative in a sense, in this sense, when you have a greater than 50% hash rate. But it's actually consistent, which is interesting. Here are some assumptions that Peter R. made in his paper. I'm going to be talking a lot about these issues as this section concludes. So there was an assumption that the time parameter had a lower bound, which I just demonstrated it potentially could not. And miners who propagate their block solutions faster will earn a larger surplus. We're going to be talking about SPV mining immediately after this. Concept of a mining cartel, which is again related to this, which I think is the equilibrium behavior, at least temporarily until the better solution is discovered. And finally, the externality problem, which I think is more important, is ignored. So how do we solve this problem? Well, a big part of the solution, in my view, is this idea of SPV mining. And this is a post from Sergio Damon Lerner, who said it first. I think that SPV mining is the solution, not the problem. I agree that it has a misleading name, so let me explain it very carefully. SPV mining is a mining strategy where someone else announces to you that they've found a block, and they send you the header, which is this thing, which is very small. I think it's 80 bytes. And you check to make sure that the header meets the proof of work requirements, which you can do because it's the headers that get all the work done on them. And if the header has a valid amount of work, you just start mining on the next header. You take the header as valid, and you skip all the transaction stuff. Normally there should be a giant tree of transactions leading up to this hash Merkle root. You skip all that, and you don't download or validate any transactions. So this is a clever trick for a number of reasons. One awesome reason is that it takes just as much work, just as much economic effort to produce an invalid block as it does to produce a valid block. But there's nothing you can do with an invalid block except trick people temporarily. If you were going to abuse this strategy, you'd have to effectively pay one block in opportunity cost just to get started, which means that this would have to somehow net you 2 blocks or more in the future, which I just think is impossible under any sane network conditions. If the block is actually propagating, if blocks are actually propagating in less than 10 minutes, then I think that is impossible. So it can't intentionally be misused. It might passively or unintentionally cause problems. But I agree with Sergio that it is actually the solution to many Bitcoin protocol problems. And I'm going to explain that. So what it does is it allows everyone to start mining immediately. So there's none of this wasted time period where there's no mining. You just get the header because the header is very fast and it's easy to validate. Oh, I already explained this. Proof of work is done on headers, not the whole blocks themselves. 80 bytes, very, very small. Just as much work to do an invalid header as a valid header. So they're expensive to fake and they teleport instantly. So the strategy is you notice a new header, you mine on it. Meanwhile, you download and validate the block. And once you've downloaded and validated, you try to insert all the transactions that are still valid. And we can improve on this strategy, but I just want to highlight what changes as a result of using this strategy, which is that Mars finds maybe 3 blocks, but while it was in the middle of finding one, Earth found a block. And Earth's block can still count because this example has teleporting headers and fast coin bases. So again, I'm aware that data can't actually teleport, but it's just an example because the headers are so small they effectively make it around the internet almost instantaneously, whereas the block can take up to 30 or 40 seconds to make it around. the entire internet. So Mars finds its blocks, and it finds block number 1, and Earth becomes aware of it immediately, and it can then start mining on this new block number 1 that does not affect the statistical properties of the mining process. So Earth will still find one block in this 40-minute set. Its block will have to be empty because it doesn't know which transactions it can safely include. Mars will find out about Earth's block. What happens here is a little bit ambiguous. I don't want to get bogged down by the details because we're going to discuss propagating the transactions right after this. So just ignore it for now. But the other thing is what Earth's block only contains a Coinbase transaction and maybe notice that everything else is empty. So it's going to go through this transit period very quickly. I still give it 1 transit period, but best case you could encode some message that would be very small. A 20-byte Bitcoin address plus some other stuff. And it would be basically as fast as the headers, the 80-byte headers, which I said were propagating instantly. So you may be able to tell what's going on here, which is that while it takes some time for Mars to get the actual transaction data, and it takes even more time for Earth to get the actual transaction data, which is I define as these filled in colorful blocks, whereas versus these empty ones. So while that does take a while, Mars and Earth are actually synchronized in the same chain, and Earth can get credit for its block subsidy. So this fully solves the problem for the subsidy. The subsidy is still very high relative to the transaction fees, 12.5 versus the last time I checked is about 1 Bitcoin per block in transaction fees, so it's still about 12 times more significant. And this solves this problem because miners can now mine a block at any time. But what they can't do is safely begin to include new transactions until they have the latest transaction data. So I'm going to claim that this fixes this incentive problem. So the question is, do you want to move from Mars to Earth? Well, currently, remember, you had these annoying episodes where you were getting empty blocks from Earth. And it wasn't later until the messages made it across that you could include them in your own blocks and earn the transaction fee revenue from them. So you couldn't harvest those transactions until they got to you from Earth. Once they get to you from Earth, you've got to split them among 75% of the hash rate because you'll be finding all of the filled blocks. You'll only be finding a few. But if 26% return to Earth, you would be first in line for these transactions as they arrive. And you'd have to split them with fewer people. So actually, there's an incentive to move back to Earth and co-locate with the transaction fees. But more interesting is that there's an incentive to invest in connectivity. So if one miner could invent some kind of bridge between Mars and Earth, it would benefit this miner disproportionately. He would be able to invest in something and earn a return in it because he would become aware of transactions in both worlds faster, and he would then know whether or not he could include those transactions in his own blocks faster. So this actually flips the bandwidth problem around and makes it much more like any other full node costs or any other mining input, such as labor or land, where if you invest in it, you'll get a return. And this is highly desirable. Now, some people are worried about whether or not SPV mining is safe. For example, Luke Jr. He has some requirements here. I think 1 is clearly, I agree with him. I'm not sure I completely agree with 2. And the reason I don't is a Peter Todd reason, which is that I think that the miner's job really shouldn't be to validate. Miners should validate for their own sake, but they shouldn't validate for our sake. We should be running our own nodes, or we should have trusted people who run nodes on our behalf that we trust for some reason. And I think if we aren't running our own node, we are trusting someone else to validate, and if we trust the miners to validate, I think that's a slightly anathema to Bitcoin. The only full node that matters is the one you run yourself. I think we should let miners mine all the invalid blocks we want. They won't get paid for those blocks, and our clients will just reject them. So we want miners to validate for their own sake, because they will eventually be caught by nodes, and that means they will not get paid. Now here are the major conclusions. I have One final point before I actually finish this section, but here's the major conclusions: that mining has certain network costs. It needs the current block, aka the current block header, so that it can mine on top of that. And it needs some incentive to mine, which in the form of the transaction fees and the block subsidy. Now, many of these fields are provided by the miner, him or herself, so there's no problem in getting these. Hash of the previous block header is something that we do need from the network, and SPV mining will provide almost instantly. So I feel that SPV mining is sort of half of this solution. Now, main chain blocks, core main chain blocks, this is partially green here, because the core main chain blocks will get their block subsidy, whereas it's the sidechain blocks that won't. So it's the sidechain that's at a disadvantage, which should be good for a hypothetical person who's very skeptical of sidechains, which is, again, the setup for this entire presentation. So this is actually mostly green for the time being, although that will change, of course, in the future. The part of this that's not green and that's blue in some sense, in that it requires some external network stimulus, the transactions which must be valid. Now, there's some absolutely wonderful work being done in this area. Bloom filters, the improved relay network. Block scheduling is something that I'm working on. I was going to put it in this presentation, but I thought it was too long. In a world where everyone uses the Lightning Network, it should be possible to actually schedule the transaction content of blocks in advance, so that just about everything in the block is fully defined in advance and has reached everyone. So miners know exactly what they need to mine and what they're going to mine next. And when someone finds the solution, they just need to propagate the nonce in their Coinbase data, and then everyone can just click on to the next block. But I haven't worked out all the bugs, and so I can't present it now. But what I can present is what I'm going to call clever transaction strategies. And this is what, if you'll forgive me, this is what I'm going to call hipster mining. It's going for low quality stuff that's rare on purpose. So the goal is to improve on empty and to upgrade an empty block to what I'm going to call an epsilon block, which is like it really could be like a beta block. It's not the alpha block that you wanted, but it's still pretty good. So maybe epsilon's not quite, maybe that's mean to this block. But the strategy is, after a new block is detected, instead of mining a block that's completely empty, you grab low quality transactions that you think were passed over by rival miners in the previous block. And by low quality, I mean are very large and they have low transaction fees. And by unpopular, I mean that you hope that they weren't in the block that was just found. So you take a clever guess, and this, right, to quote this Mr. Lopp here, this is probably a safe strategy because the fee rates are so low. Miners are nearly assured that these transactions were not mined in the parent block. I consider this an improvement because instead of the miners giving us empty blocks, they're cleaning up the UTXO set. I think the real improvement is just that the miners can get some money for mining. Well, I don't know if miners are doing this, but I hope they are. I think they will be doing something like this in the future. All the miners need to do is agree on some kind of transaction priority, and then they can all have the same queue, the same line, like the British queue. Well, block is found with all the alpha transactions, the high quality ones, and then that block is announced, a new block is announced to everyone, and people know, okay, it's time to grab from the lower tier until we've downloaded and validated this block. And the faster they downloaded and validated it, faster they can switch to alpha transactions, the more revenues they'll have. And so again, it's an incentive to invest in bandwidth. So it solves this weird incentive glitch, which I think is great. And I look forward to presenting my own idea at some point, fully predefining the blocks. And my idea will only work when Lightning Network is a big thing, so it's probably years away. Conclusion, we want to push bandwidth into the full node costs category, but this is hard. Bandwidth is a distance between two people. So fundamentally, the network will only be able to grow X big without losing a bunch of nodes, which is the paper I mentioned earlier, which is this on scaling decentralized blockchains. Ideally, miners would always have up-to-date information. They can get this very easily, so that's nice. This they cannot. More work is needed, but I think promising solutions already exist today. I think we had the near blocks. And so I really think this is coming along very well. I think we're already 90% of the way there, and we would be 100%. I didn't really talk a lot about sidechains or main chain versus sidechain. I just talked about bandwidth in general. And so I'd like to take a moment to mention this asymmetric quality. So regular main chain Bitcoin is on top, and the sidechains are beneath in a hierarchy. And you could even have sidechains of sidechains if you liked. Anything with an arrow pointed toward it needs to consent to this relationship here. It can terminate this relationship at any time. If there are bandwidth related problems, which network messages do you think will take priority? This one, which is the only one that gets a block subsidy, the 12.5. Everything else only gets transaction fees. I think it's pretty clear that if there are problems, it's very likely that the lower level chains will start to die first. And what's most likely of all, miners will just announce that there's not enough bandwidth to go around and that they have to start closing down other units in the next month or so. So my goal when designing DriveChain was deliberately to push as many problems as possible away from the main chain and into each sidechain, and I think I largely succeeded. In that goal. And as a result, the bandwidth itself exists in sort of tiers that can fail in a safe way. So my view is actually that if bandwidth is to be increased, it might be safest to do so via sidechains. I wouldn't bet the farm on that, but I like this idea of it moving the bandwidth up, and maybe we end up with a node difficult to run, and only great internet countries like South Korea and Japan and Google Fiber people are on this network, whereas all the slower people are on maybe the Mainchain Bitcoin or on a different sidechain that's specialized for a different reason. So I actually think that there's huge gains here. The problems and risks are quite solvable and on their way to already being solved. But in addition, the very structure of this asymmetric sidechain setup insulates us from even more risk.